Hebrews overall is a primary example of what's called typology, which is a key to understanding the relationship between the Old and New Testament. I'm quoting out of Henry Vickler's book, Hermeneutics, where he says, typology is based on the assumption that there's a pattern in God's work throughout salvation history. God prefigured his redemptive work in the Old Testament and fulfilled it in the New. In the Old Testament are shadows of things to be more fully revealed in the New. The ceremonial laws of the Old Testament, for example, demonstrated to Old Testament believers the necessity of atonement for their sins. These ceremonies pointed forward to the perfect atonement made in Christ. The prefigurement is called the type. The corresponding figure, the fulfillment, is called the antitype. Now, what in the world is that all about? What did I just say? This can be really confusing. And the reason it can be so confusing is because when you read many biblical commentaries, they'll talk about something being a type in the Old Testament. For example, the sacrificial lamb in the Old Testament was a type of Christ's future death on the cross. So far, that makes sense. But then, many commentaries go on to say that Christ's death was the antitype. What? The way we use the word anti means opposite. That it's, and if it's opposite, why do we call the fulfillment the antitype? Well, that's because the actual Greek word, which we don't know, but all these commentators do, so they assume we do. But anyway, the Greek word antitype in this usage is actually the Greek word antitupos. And what that means is corresponding as an impression to the die. It's, you take a die and you strike something. The die is the type. What you strike and what comes out's the antitype. Now, then, when I heard that made great sense to me because, now bear with me here, one of the many jobs that I've had in my long work life is I used to be I still do it actually, a publication designer. And part of being a publication designer is an understanding of topography. The term antitupos, corresponding as an impression to the die, makes perfect sense when you think of it in terms of setting type. When type is set to the typesetter, it looks upside down and backwards. It's all there, but it's not easy to read. But when the impression of it is made, the antitype, the antitupos, the meaning's clear. Now here's an illustration of it. On the video, I show you the type of Merry Christmas that's upside down and backwards, but then you print it, it's really clear. It makes perfectly good sense. And here's how this ties into Hebrews. The Old Testament tabernacle is identified as a type in Hebrews. The first tabernacle was a figure for the time then present. The high priest's entrance into the holiest place once a year prefigured the mediation of Christ, our high priest. Later, the veil of the tabernacle is said to be a type of Christ, in that his flesh was torn, as the veil was when he was crucified, in order to provide entrance into God's presence for those who are covered by his sacrifice. The whole sacrificial system is seen as a type in Hebrews 9:19 through 26. So let me go into some specific examples of how Jesus was this type in the tabernacle that Hebrews refers back to and then says this is what happened. Outside the tabernacle, Jesus describes himself as the door. There was only one way into the tabernacle, only one way to get to God. The altar for sacrifices is what you needed to come to next, and the sacrifice had to be made again before you could come to God, which Jesus had to be sacrificed to make it possible for people to approach a holy God. But this was never enough. Once you were on the inside, you came to the Holy of Holies, where you had the place where there was the incense and the bread and these different things prefigured Christ as the light of the world, Christ as the bread of life. But then in the Holy of Holies, where there was the Ark of the Covenant, once a year on the Day of Atonement, the priest would pour out the blood. It covered sins, but it didn't take them away. And Hebrews talks about how when Jesus shed his blood, That was the final sacrifice. And then after that, what was really neat is the way was made open to God. And what happened when Jesus actually died on the cross, the veil between the holy place and the Holy of Holies was actually 60 feet long, 30 feet high, and 4 inches thick. And when Jesus died on the cross, when he said, "It is finished," the veil was torn in two. And now, visually, it was illustrated to people that the entrance to God was open to everyone because of the death of Jesus. What had been a symbol, a type of separation, now became one of free access. And again, this is what Hebrews is telling us. All these things were foretold in the past. They came true in Jesus.